The Sherlock Holmes case, that Baroque Sherlock Holmes. A killer who doesn't just murder people. They erase their entire existence and rewrite their stories. And they're still out there. Listen to this and tell me it doesn't give you chills. A famous author sits at her typewriter, writing her final chapter. The last words she ever types. And then the truth became, she never finishes that sentence. Because someone made sure she couldn't. But here's what will absolutely terrify you. The room was locked from the inside, impossible to escape her final manuscript chapter. Completely vanished, the killer left no fingerprints, no evidence, and no trace, and get this, other people connected to her have now disappeared. This isn't just murder. This is someone who steals ideas, rewrites history, and erases people like they never existed. Even Sherlock Holmes said this was the most disturbing case he'd ever encountered. Why? Because the killer isn't done. They're still writing, still erasing, still hunting. Drop it in the comments if you think you can solve this before Holmes does! And seriously, smash that subscribe button, because this story has more plot twists than a Christopher Nolan movie, and the ending. It will literally make you question everything you thought you knew about reality. Stay tuned, because I'm about to reveal the killer's real identity. And trust me, it's someone you'll never see coming. It was a bitter morning in late October when Mrs. Daphne Cavendish, a celebrated author of serialized mysteries, was found dead in her study in Hampstead Heath. The wind howled outside, rattling the panes of the tall Georgian windows. She had been working on the final chapter of her latest novel, The Man Who Forgot to Die, a story eagerly awaited by her readers and set to reveal the final twist in her labyrinthine plot. But instead of a triumphant conclusion, the manuscript ended mid-sentence on her typewriter, the ribbon still fresh with ink. And then the truth became, Inspector Lestrade summoned us shortly after breakfast. Holmes, sipping weak tea in our Baker Street lodgings, perked up instantly at the mention of Cavendish. I recall her reviews in the Times, Watson, he said, donning his coat. An ingenious plotter, though often accused of overcomplication. Let us see whether life has now outwritten fiction. The study where Daphne had died was a picture of literary chaos, papers strewn across the desk, ash from a half-burned cigarette on the Persian rug, and an overturned teacup by her chair. Yet the most curious feature was the locked door. It had been bolted from the inside, with only one small window, far too narrow for anyone to escape through, left slightly ajar. Death by poison, said Lestrade grimly, pointing to the teacup. Traces of cyanide, but no prints on the cup, and no sign of forced entry. A classic locked room mystery. Holmes murmured, crouching by the fireplace. He tapped the cold iron grate, then examined the scattered manuscript pages. You've ruled out suicide. Lestrade nodded. She had everything to live for. Popular, wealthy, were by all accounts in good spirits. Her housekeeper heard her typing just half an hour before she was found slumped over. Holmes rose and paced. There is always a motive, Inspector. The trick is finding the one that hides in plain sight. We interviewed the few people who had access to the house. The housekeeper, Mrs. Huxley, swore she had been polishing the silver downstairs and heard nothing unusual. The gardener, a sullen young man named Clive, claimed he was in the greenhouse throughout the morning. Both seemed genuinely shocked by Cavendish's death. She was a creature of habit, Mrs. Huxley told us. Tea at 9, writing until noon. She locked the study door from inside every morning, said she couldn't work unless the world was shut out. Holmes studied the teacup again. Where was the tea prepared? In the kitchen, sir. I brewed it myself. Holmes sniffed the remains in the cup, then the pot in the kitchen. "There's no bitterness in the pot's leaves," he said. "The poison must have been added afterward, directly into the cup." "But how?" I asked. "The door was locked. The window too small," Holmes agreed. "Unless someone passed something through it." Back in the study, Holmes measured the distance from the desk to the window. Watson observed the position of the typewriter. Had she been facing the desk, someone reaching through the window could not have been seen unless she turned. Lestrade furrowed his brow. "You're suggesting the killer slipped something into her cup through the window while she was typing?" Holmes held up a pair of sugar cubes from the saucer. "This one is slightly off color, Watson." I took it and sniffed. "Almond. Cyanide?" Holmes nodded. "Our killer used sugar as a vehicle. A pre-poisoned cube passed through the window by someone she knew. Someone whose presence would not raise alarm." "But who?" I asked. Holmes gestured to the desk. "The answer lies within these pages." We spent the next hour reading through the unfinished manuscript. The plot was intricate. A writer is stalked by a mysterious figure who claims to know how her stories end before she writes them. Pages were missing, specifically from the final chapter. "Notice this, Watson," Holmes said, tapping the typewriter. "The last sentence ends in a dash." Not a period. She was interrupted. Perhaps by the killer, or perhaps by a sudden realization. He turned to Lestrade. "Were any visitors recorded this morning?" Lestrade consulted his notebook. "Only one, Mr. Roland Hargreaves, a fellow novelist. They had tea irregularly on Thursdays." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Bring him here." Roland Hargreaves was a lean man with a pointed beard and eyes too quick to rest. He professed deep grief for Daphne's passing, but Holmes was already watching him with unsettling focus. "You were friends?" Holmes asked. "Colleagues," Hargreaves corrected. "We shared a publisher. I admired her success, of course." "You were expected this morning?" "No, Thursdays usually. Today was a fluke. I came by to drop off a note." Holmes pointed to the desk. "Where is that note?" Hargreaves blinked. "She must have misplaced it." "No such note exists," Holmes said. "But something else does." He retrieved a page from beneath the study's Persian rug, a page torn from the final chapter. "You left in a hurry." On the page was scribbled a single sentence, written in Cavendish's hand. It was not fiction. He told me the ending before I wrote it. Holmes faced Hargreaves. "You fed her ideas, didn't you?" Subtle prompts disguised as casual remarks. But this time, she recognized the manipulation. She realized your stories were not parallel inspirations. They were stolen outlines. "That's absurd." Hargreaves snapped. She caught on. "You panicked. But you knew her habits. You brought a poisoned sugar cube, slipped it through the window while pretending to greet her. She never saw you, but she tasted your revenge." Hargreaves turned pale. "You can't prove that." Holmes held up the sugar cube in a wax paper wrap. "No." "Then perhaps your fingerprints will enlighten us." Lestrade stepped forward with handcuffs. "That's quite enough fiction for one day." As Hargreaves was led away, Holmes returned to the typewriter. "A shame," he said softly. "We'll never know how her novel was meant to end." But I wasn't so sure. For in her scrawled final note, and the symmetry of her death mirroring her plot, I saw a fitting, if tragic, conclusion. Holmes, as ever, had solved the mystery. But only Daphne Cavendish had written her own ending. Holmes lingered after Lestrade departed with Hargreaves in tow. The shadows lengthening across the study walls as the autumn light faded. I stood quietly by the window, the faint rustle of leaves brushing against the pane. Something in Holmes's expression told me He had not yet placed the final stone in the puzzle. Though Hargreaves had motive and means, Holmes's silence hinted at a deeper chord being struck. "The pieces fit," I ventured. "But you're not satisfied." Holmes glanced at the torn manuscript page again. A confession wrapped in fiction, perhaps. Yet too many edges remain rough. Why steal the last pages if the murder was already committed? Why not destroy the manuscript entirely? And most troubling, why return to deliver the poisoned sugar in such a visible way? But he was the only one who knew her habits well enough, I said. Holmes raised a brow. Knew them, or wanted us to believe he did. He returned to the desk, examining it with renewed purpose. His eyes narrowed as he pulled open a slim drawer and removed a fountain pen, uncapped, dry. Beside it lay a crumpled envelope addressed not to Hargreaves, but to a Miss Lydia Wren. Holmes held it between two fingers. "I do not recall this name among her acquaintances." "Perhaps a relative," I offered. Holmes turned the envelope over, no postage. Hand delivered. A note of urgency in the fold. He slipped the letter free. The contents were brief, a single sentence in a hurried hand. "He knows I've rewritten the ending. Burn it if I don't return." "She expected something," I murmured. "Expected danger? More than that," Holmes said. "She anticipated betrayal. This Lydia Wren may hold a key we've overlooked." We asked Mrs. Huxley about the name, and the housekeeper's face tightened at once. "Miss Lydia was her secretary of sorts," she said reluctantly. "Not official, but she came by often, helped with dictation. Miss Cavendish didn't trust typists, said they always ruined her cadence. Lydia had a way with words. Clever girl. Too clever, maybe. Where can we find her?" Holmes asked. "Lives near Primrose Hill. Flat above a bookshop called Thistle and Ink." By the time we reached the shop, dusk had surrendered to night. The gas lamps flickered as Holmes knocked at the door above. Lydia Wren answered, slender and pale, with stormy grey eyes that studied us before speaking. "Miss Wren," Holmes began, "we're investigating Daphne Cavendish's death." "I heard," she said quietly, stepping aside to let us in. Her flat was small but orderly, bookshelves packed to bursting, a teacup half full on the table beside a notebook filled with scribbled phrases. The inspector already asked questions. Said it was that other writer, Hargreaves. "And yet you do not seem surprised." "I'm not," she said. "But I'm not convinced either." Holmes nodded slightly, inviting her to continue. "She told me a week ago she was rewriting the ending. Said she'd discovered a better truth for the final scene. That's how she put it. A better truth. She was frightened after that. Said someone had been through her papers while she was out." "Did she mention who?" I asked. "No. But she suspected someone close. She even locked the pages in her bureau drawer when she wasn't working." Holmes leaned forward. "This morning, did you come to the house?" "No. I was meant to visit tomorrow." "Miss Wren," Holmes said carefully, "did you burn the rewritten ending?" Lydia hesitated. Her hand curled tightly around the edge of her chair. "I didn't. I didn't even know where she hid it." "But you received her letter." Tears welled in her eyes. "It arrived after I heard she was dead. I couldn't bring myself to open it until an hour ago. I didn't know what to do." Holmes studied her, his expression unreadable. He turned his attention to the notebook beside the teacup. A single word had been circled several times in the margins recon. A writer's term, he mused aloud. Retroactive continuity. Changing the past to suit the present. She was rewriting more than just her story. Maybe she was rewriting the truth, Lydia whispered. Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then he rose, walking slowly to the window. You've kept the same tea blend as Daphne, Darjeeling and cinnamon. Familiar habits. A mind trained in mimicry. No wonder she trusted you. Lydia stiffened, unsure whether she was being accused or praised. You noticed something others missed, Miss Wren. Something about Roland. He was obsessive, she said quickly. Daphne used to joke that he'd have killed to come up with her twists. But something else still troubles me, Holmes said. She was working when she died, typing. That means she added the poisoned sugar herself. Then maybe it was suicide, I asked. Holmes shook his head. No, she was too methodical. If she'd intended death, she would have ended her sentence. He turned back to Lydia. But perhaps someone she trusted passed her a cube and said, "This is sweeter than usual. Try it." And she did. Lydia looked away, silent. "We'll need the original manuscript," Holmes said. "I suspect Daphne left it in a place only one person could find." Lydia's shoulders dropped. She stood across the room and unlocked a drawer in her writing desk. Inside was a leather folio, its pages neatly bound. She handed it to Holmes. "I wasn't going to destroy it," she said. "Just read it once." She left my name in the acknowledgements. Holmes opened the final chapter. He read swiftly, then slowly, and finally aloud. And as he stood over her, whispering that her tale was his to finish, she smiled, because she'd known all along how he would end it. A silence settled over us. "Proof?" I said. She knew Hargreaves would try something. Holmes closed the folio. Or someone else. He turned to Lydia with narrowed eyes. "You said she was frightened. But her final scene shows calm, resolution. She wasn't afraid of dying. She knew it would complete her story." Which begs the question, did she plan her own death to trap her murderer? Or did she write it after being poisoned, knowing someone would read it and recognize themselves? Lydia paled again. "She trusted you," Holmes said gently, with her words. "But trust can be a dangerous gift." Her voice broke in a whisper. "I didn't poison her, I swear." Holmes said nothing, only reached into his coat and withdrew the dried sugar cube. He held it near her teacup. "Would you be willing to try your own?" Her hand trembled as she pushed the cup away. Holmes returned the cube to his pocket. "No. I don't think it was you. But someone tried very hard to frame Hargreaves. And they almost succeeded." Outside, the street lamps flickered to life. Holmes stood at the window, gazing out as if expecting the night to give up its secrets. "There's another player in this tale, Watson. Someone hidden in the margins." And with that, we left the flat, the sound of Lydia Wren's sobs muffled by the closing door, and the mystery of the erased ending still turning like a page yet unread. Rain misted the cobblestones as Holmes and I stepped back onto the street, the fog from Primrose Hill creeping through the lanes like a slow, breathing beast. Holmes walked briskly, head down, cloak drawn tight. His mind clearly turning over fresh fragments of the puzzle. I struggled to keep up as he led us not back to Baker Street, but instead toward Hampstead again, straight to the Cavendish house. "She wasn't writing a mystery, Watson," he said suddenly. "She was living one. And her final chapter was the trap she baited for the guilty. But if Lydia didn't poison her, and Hargreaves was only a distraction, then we've missed someone." "Precisely. Someone behind the curtain. And like any proper mystery, the minor characters always deserve a second look." "At the Cavendish home, Mrs. Huxley answered the door, her apron freshly pressed, though her face bore new lines of fatigue. "With a few more questions," Holmes said gently. "Strictly routine." She let us in with a nod, wringing her hands. The study was as we had left it. Except now the desk had been dusted and the fire laid again, unlit. Holmes looked toward the empty teacup, still sitting on the mantel. "You told us earlier," he began, "that you prepared her tea." "Yes, sir. But not this cup." Her fingers tightened around the fabric of her apron. "No. I poured the pot as usual and set the tray outside her door. She didn't like being disturbed once she was writing." Holmes paced slowly. "And who placed the sugar on the saucer?" She hesitated. "It's always there. I set it out with the tray. Daphne, Miss Cavendish, preferred cubes. And this morning, I did the same." "Did anyone else have access to the kitchen before you brought the tray up?" Her eyes flicked up, just for a second, toward the staircase. "Only Clive, the gardener," she admitted. "He came in early, said it was too wet to work outside, so he had tea in the back scullery. He left before 8. Holmes turned sharply. "Clive? Does he often come inside?" "Only when it's raining." Miss Cavendish didn't mind, long as he stayed out of her way. We found Clive in the rear potting shed, scraping soil from the edge of a spade. He straightened quickly when he saw us. "I've already told the inspector everything," he said. "I was in the greenhouse till nearly 9. But Mrs. Huxley says you were in the scullery around 7:30. Clive's jaw shifted. Briefly. It was cold. Just needed warmth. "You didn't touch the tea tray?" He shrugged. "Didn't notice it." "Did you know Miss Cavendish's tea habits?" He smirked. "Everyone did. She was like clockwork. And yet you never crossed paths with her." He looked uncomfortable. "Not really. Once or twice she spoke to me. That's it." Holmes stepped closer. "Yet you knew she preferred cubes over loose sugar. That her door was always locked from inside. You even knew which window she left open." "I'm a gardener," Clive said tightly. "I work the grounds. I notice things." Holmes gave him a long look, then nodded. "Indeed. Thank you." Back in the front hall, I caught his sleeve. "You think he's hiding something?" "They all are, Watson. That's the problem. Everyone's truth is a costume stitched together to hide the seams. But some threads don't match." Holmes gestured for Mrs. Huxley again. "Has anyone else been in the study since the police left?" She shook her head. "No, sir. I dusted around the desk, but I didn't touch anything. And the bureau? Locked. I don't have the key." Holmes motioned to the bureau drawer. A small silver key still protruded from the lock. "She must have forgotten to remove it," I said. Holmes opened it carefully. Inside were more pages of manuscript, early drafts and, strangely, a pile of envelopes addressed to Lydia Wren, all unsent. He examined them one by one. The tone varied. Some were affectionate, others wary, even accusatory. The last one, undated, ready. "You said you destroyed the outline. If I find it published anywhere else, I swear I will make the truth known." "She feared Lydia?" I said. Holmes nodded. "Feared or felt betrayed. There's more to Miss Wren's involvement than she let on. But the timing still bothers me. Everything hinges on when the poison was administered. And one contradiction keeps nagging at me." "What's that?" Holmes knelt and studied the writing desk again, opening the drawer where the typewriter sat. Behind it, wedged tight, he found a small, folded cloth, stained faintly with red. He held it up. "A handkerchief," I observed. "Lip rouge," Holmes corrected. "And not Miss Cavendish's brand. She wore none." He stood. "Someone else was here that morning. Someone who got close enough to whisper something, pass a sugar cube, or even wipe their mouth after a farewell kiss. Someone who left in a hurry." "You think Lydia came to the house after all?" "No. Someone we've not spoken to yet. Someone invisible until now." Holmes turned back to Mrs. Huxley, who had been listening from the doorway. Miss Cavendish had callers in the last week. Friends, perhaps fans. The housekeeper hesitated again. There was one, a young woman. Showed up unannounced last Friday. Said she was a student of Miss Cavendish's work. Wore a red coat. They argued, quietly, but I heard the tension. Miss Cavendish told me not to mention it. Did you catch her name? Vera. Vera something. She left in tears. Holmes's eyes narrowed. A reader scorned. Or a thief exposed. He was silent a long moment, then snapped his fingers. Com Watson. Back to Lydia's. She may not have lied. At least, not fully. But I believe she left out a crucial name. The rain had grown heavier by the time we returned to Primrose Hill. Lydia answered, looking pale, her hands ink smudged. Holmes stepped inside briskly. Miss Wren, we need to know who Vera is. The color drained from her face. How do you know that name? You told her about the manuscript, didn't you? Holmes said, voice even. Perhaps you didn't mean harm. Perhaps you thought Vera admired Daphne's work and would be discreet. But she wasn't. Lydia sat slowly, eyes wide. She was a fan. She found me through an essay I wrote. I didn't think I never thought she'd show up uninvited. Did she ever handle Daphne's drafts? I showed her one. Just one page. A scene I helped edit. Did she know about the locked door? The window? She asked. I thought it was curiosity. Holmes sighed. Curiosity killed more than the cat, Miss Wren. I believe Vera wanted to be more than a reader. She wanted to be part of the ending. And somewhere in London, Holmes now knew, a young woman in a red coat was walking free, having stepped through fiction into murder, and left her name behind in silence. The fog lay thick over London as Holmes and I departed Lydia Wren's flat. Our silhouettes swallowed by lamplight and drizzle. Neither of us spoke as we walked. There was something heavy in the silence, not despair, but deep thought congealing around the truth. Holmes's brows were drawn, lips taut, as though even now he was rearranging the cast of characters in his mind, stripping away their farce aids to find the true face beneath. We now have too many motives, I said finally, and not one of them wholly fits. That, Holmes replied, is precisely the problem. When everyone has reason, someone is using the noise to stay hidden. We returned to Baker Street, where the warmth of the fire and the clink of china in Mrs. Hudson's hands felt too civilized for the grim knots we were unraveling. Holmes poured himself a cup of tea, but did not drink it. He stood at the fireplace, staring into the flames. Let's map it, Watson, he said at last. Strip it bare. I drew out a sheet of paper and Holmes began dictating. Roland Hargreaves, he said. Jealousy. He resented Daphne's success and feared exposure for borrowing her ideas. But he lacked subtlety. His every move screamed panic. I believe he would have killed to silence her, but his performance was too dramatic, too early. Next. Lydia Wren. Secretive, fearful, possibly manipulated, certainly complicit in hiding details. Her motive could be fear of losing Daphne's trust, or her own ambitions ruined if she was caught sharing drafts with Vera. Vera, I muttered. The Phantom. Holmes nodded. Unknown surname. A young admirer who knew enough to copy the writing style, ask the right questions, and find her way into Daphne's trust. If only briefly. I suspect a deep obsession. She didn't want to read the ending. She wanted to be the ending. What of Clive? Or the housekeeper? Clive, less likely. He's crude, but has no finesse. A man who knows which window is open, but wouldn't risk slipping through it with a sugar cube in hand. Mrs. Huxley. Perhaps too devoted. Or too blind. And what about the manuscript? I asked. The true ending. It's in our hands now. Holmes turned from the fire and crossed to his desk. He opened the folio once more and flipped through its final chapter, lips moving silently as he reread the last few paragraphs. Then he tapped a single sentence with his forefinger. She described the killer's hands as ink-stained, trembling not from guilt but exhilaration. Not the hands of a man who gardened, not a woman who kept house, a writer, or someone pretending to be one. Lydia, I ventured. She doesn't write, Holmes corrected. She edits. She curates. Vera then. Holmes didn't answer. He was staring not at the manuscript, but at the envelope it had been sealed in. His eyes narrowed. There's a return address here. But it's not Daphne's. I looked closer. 15 Pembury Lane, Islington. That's not her home. Holmes tapped it again. That's the shop address. Thistle and ink. Lydia's address. But she said she didn't know where Daphne had hidden the pages. Holmes smiled faintly. Indeed. So how did the folio arrive in an envelope marked with Lydia's shop address? It was enough to bring us back to Lydia's door, this time without a knock. Holmes stepped inside with an authority that made Lydia freeze mid-sentence. You said you hadn't seen the manuscript until we asked for it, he said. But the envelope bears your address. Her mouth opened, then shut again. I was afraid, she whispered. Afraid you'd think I stole it. Daphne gave it to me a day before she died, asked me to keep it safe. I didn't read it until after she was gone. Yet you said you didn't know where it was. I didn't want you thinking I'd tampered with it. But you had. You read it. You recognized the ending was a message. She nodded miserably. I thought maybe she meant to publish it herself. Posthumously. I wasn't sure if I should protect her, or expose her killer. Holmes stepped closer. Miss Wren, what did Vera want from you? Lydia swallowed hard. She wanted to be part of Daphne's world. She called it sacred, her words. I thought she was harmless. She said she just wanted advice. But one day she brought me a short story, something she claimed she'd written. It was identical to one of Daphne's unpublished drafts. She had access, I said. Somehow. Lydia nodded. And when I asked where she got it, she said, truth belongs to those brave enough to use it. That's when I knew she wasn't just a fan. She wanted Daphne's legacy. She wanted to replace her. Holmes's face was unreadable. Miss Wren, he said, voice like a scalpel. Did you ever see her again after that? No, Lydia whispered. She vanished. Back in our rooms, Holmes sat again with the envelope in hand. He took a magnifying glass to the seal. After a moment, he murmured, red wax. Not Cavendish's usual blue. This was resealed. Someone read it before we did. He flipped the envelope inside out. A slip of paper had been folded into the lining, missed on first inspection. He drew it out carefully. It read only, you told me endings were sacred. This is mine now. Not Daphne's hand, Holmes said. And not Lydia's. We stared at the note in silence. She took the manuscript, Holmes said. She read the ending. She resealed it and planted it for us to find. Why leave it at all? Because a perfect crime needs an ending. And our mystery writer needed to feel she'd written the final word. The rain lashed against the windows. Outside, London was dark and watchful. Somewhere out there, Vera remained a phantom, writer, reader, murderer. And Holmes, at last, began to see the shape of her motive. Not greed, not vengeance, but authorship. A desire not just to kill, but to narrate. She wanted to erase Daphne's ending, he said quietly, so she could write her own. 2 mornings later, a sharp rap at the door interrupted our quiet breakfast at Baker Street. Inspector Lestrade entered. damp from the rain and unusually triumphant. "Well, Holmes," he said, removing his hat with a flourish, "you can stand down. The Cavendish case is closed." Holmes raised an eyebrow without moving from his chair. "Indeed, Clive Hemmings, the gardener. We picked him up late last night in Kent. He was trying to leave the country." Holmes's spoon hovered above his teacup. "To Kent?" He claimed he was visiting a cousin, but he didn't make it past the train station. "We found a packet of strychnine in his satchel. Same type found in the sugar cube." "Curious," Holmes murmured. "Where exactly was he headed?" Lestrade waved a paper. "Folkestone. Ferry to Boulogne. We found muddy shoes, a half-burned scarf in his shed that matched fibres on Daphne Cavendish's writing chair, and get this, he had several clippings of her novels in his drawer. Obsessed with her." "Did he confess?" I asked. "He denied everything," Lestrade admitted, "but the evidence lines up. Motive means opportunity. The courts won't need much more." Holmes sipped his tea and looked down into the swirling dark. "No, I don't suppose they will." Lestrade beamed. "Thought you'd be pleased. This one nearly had your name on it. Still, you're slipping, Holmes. Missed the killer right under your nose." Holmes stood and walked to the window. The glass was fogged with condensation. "Clive Hemmings may be many things, but he is not a reader, Inspector, nor is he a mimic, or a forger of style, and certainly not the type to know how to reseal an envelope without leaving a trace." Lestrade frowned. "You think he's innocent?" "I think he's convenient," Holmes said. "Too convenient." Lestrade gave an incredulous laugh. "You've always got to make it difficult." "I've always had to go beyond appearances. Do you know what the greatest trick a murderer can pull is? Not hiding the weapon or faking an alibi, but giving the world a villain it desperately wants to catch." When Lestrade had gone, Holmes paced slowly, hands clasped behind his back. "It's too clean," he muttered. "Too symmetrical. The packet of poison, the clippings, a sudden dash to the coast. Either Clive is the most obliging scapegoat I've ever seen, or someone wanted him to take the fall." I watched him pause before the fireplace, gaze fixed on the dying coals. "And I believe she knew exactly how to bait him," Holmes said. "You think Vera planted the evidence?" "I think she didn't have to. She only had to wait until Clive stumbled through the trap she left. Someone who worked nearby, who knew the layout, who was once rebuked or dismissed by Miss Cavendish." He turned to me sharply. "Find someone in Daphne's life who felt forgotten, overlooked, but clever enough to write in her voice." "What about the letter?" I asked. "The note in the envelope, 'This is mine now.' Clive could never have written that." "No," Holmes said softly. "But Lydia could have." "Holmes, surely not. She lied about the manuscript. She lied about Vera's last visit. What if Vera was never here to kill, but only to be seen?" I stood shaken. "Are you saying Lydia framed Vera? Or worse, used her?" "I'm saying Lydia had the opportunity, the skill, and the motive to finish Daphne's work in the most literal way. Vera was ambitious, but Lydia was methodical." Holmes began pulling documents from the desk. Notes, drafts, letters from Daphne's bureau. She spoke of betrayal in her last pages, about someone stealing her voice. And who would know that voice better than the woman who curated every sentence she ever published? Then Vera may have been real, but she was useful to Lydia. A ghost to hide behind. There was a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Hudson, holding a telegram. Holmes opened it quickly, scanning the lines. He handed it to me without a word. "To Sherlock Holmes from Thistle and Ink Booksellers, Islington, Vera R. Cartwright inquired today after unpublished Cavendish works, asked about editorial rights, left no address, signed a visitor's log under false name. Staff now recalls seeing her at least twice last week. I lowered the paper slowly. She's still out there. Holmes nodded. And the real killer's confidence grows. Vera's not finished. She thinks she's won. Or worse, she believes we're playing by her rules. And what do we do now? We prepare the stage, Holmes said. The curtain hasn't fallen yet. He stepped back to the envelope and unfolded the final page of Daphne's manuscript, placing it in the center of the desk like a relic. The ink gleamed faintly, her last words etched not in sorrow but defiance. Daphne knew someone would come for her ending, Holmes murmured. She left it behind not just as a story, but as a trap. And somewhere beyond the fog, a woman read her name aloud, not Vera's, nor Lydia's, but something newly invented, waiting for the applause. The rain fell steadily that night, a rhythmic tapping against the windows as Holmes sat, unmoving, before the manuscript. I watched him in silence, the fire casting long shadows across the room. He wasn't reading any longer. His eyes had long since stopped seeing the page. He was listening, as he often did, not to the sounds around him, but to the echoes in his memory. When he finally spoke, it was not to me, but as though to the room itself. "I've read these words before." I leaned forward. "You mean the final chapter?" "No," he said, voice distant. "The phrasing, the cadence. It's not entirely Daphne's. There's something else beneath it, something older. It's been haunting me since I first saw that envelope." He stood abruptly, crossed to the tall cabinet in the corner, and withdrew a large leather-bound volume. Dust puffed from it as he opened the cover. Inside were clippings, scores of them, old crime reports, author interviews, obituaries, even theater programs, all meticulously catalogued by Holmes over the years. "I once investigated a fraud involving a literary estate, 87, I believe. A minor poet, name of Sebastian Reyes. His final works were discovered posthumously, and it caused a brief sensation, until it was discovered someone else had written them. A forgery, but an expert one. The case never led to prosecution. The culprit vanished. And you think this is related?" "I remember something," Holmes said, flipping pages rapidly. "The style, the voice, the arrogance of the forgery, it's identical. She wasn't copying Daphne. She's done this before." He paused at a yellowed clipping. I stepped beside him and read the headline. "Ruz posthumous volume eclipsed by lies. Claims editor." Beneath it, a photograph, faded, grainy, but unmistakable. It was Lydia Wren, younger perhaps by a decade but recognizable. "She claimed to be an assistant then," Holmes said. "Said she'd only helped with the archives. But the editor of the Reyes estate suspected someone had stolen notes, maybe even fragments of poems, and built something false around them. The scandal was buried. Too little proof, too few willing to ruin the legacy. Do you think she wrote them?" "I think she practiced," Holmes said. "I think Daphne Cavendish was her masterpiece." A long silence followed. "Then what of Vera? She's the decoy? The shadow Lydia hides behind. But she's not an invention, she's real. And she's close." That night we returned to Islington. Thistle and Ink was closed, but the windows of the flat above glowed faintly. Holmes led us down a narrow alley beside the building to a rear door we'd passed before without notice. He tried the handle. It was unlocked. We entered into darkness. The air was heavy with paper and ink, the scent of long, unread books. Holmes moved without hesitation, torchlight sweeping the cramped hallway. We passed shelves and boxes, an old writing desk, and finally a small room lined with corkboards. Notes were pinned in rows, quotes, photos, timelines. At the center of the wall was Daphne's face. Beneath it Lydia, Clive, Roland, and Vera. A web of red string tied them all together, anchored not in crime, but in story structure. Arrows pointing to climax, resolution, motive. "It's not a murder board," I whispered. "It's a plot outline." Holmes nodded grimly. "She's writing it still." There in the corner lay a stack of notebooks. Holmes lifted the top one and flipped through it. Notes on Daphne's habits, her diet, the brands of her cigarettes, her speech patterns. And then, phrases like a gradual erasure, and ending not with a bang, but with misdirection. On the final page was a name we had not seen before. Clara Royce. I read aloud. Holmes turned sharply. "That's it?" "What is?" "Her real name." Lydia Wren was Clara Royce before she disappeared from public life after the Rise affair. She rebranded. Changed careers. Hid in the literary world, not as a writer, but as an editor. She needed to disappear, I said slowly, but couldn't stay away from the page. She learned, Holmes said. Studied voices. Ghostwrote. Improved. Daphne wasn't just a victim. She was the culmination of years of preparation. And Vera. He turned to the wall again, eyes scanning the scattered notes. She may be many things, but one thing is clear. Clara needed her to witness the story, to validate it. Vera is the reader, the one to tell the world how Daphne Cavendish ended. Then Holmes's eyes locked on something in the corner, an old photo pinned beneath a curling news clipping. It showed two young women seated on a bench. One was clearly a young Daphne, hair darker, but the face unmistakable. The other, smiling shyly beside her, was Clara Royce. They knew each other, I said. From university, perhaps, or a workshop. This wasn't ambition. It was obsession. Clara watched Daphne rise. Perhaps they started together, but only one succeeded. Clara fell behind, and Daphne didn't look back. Until Clara made sure she couldn't. Holmes took the photo and slipped it into his coat. "We need to find Vera," he said, "before Clara writes her out too." The house was silent as we left, the street empty and slick with rain. But I could feel it, that we were being watched. Somewhere beyond the lamplight Clara, Clara Royce, was waiting, quill poised. Not yet finished. Holmes didn't speak again until we reached Baker Street. "This is no longer a case of murder," he said, quietly. "It's a story. One she's been writing for years. But she made one mistake." "What's that?" "She underestimated her reader." And with that, he returned to his desk, lit a fresh lamp, and began writing. Not a story, but a trap. For Clara, there would be no sequel. The following morning broke overcast and sullen, as though the city itself held its breath. Holmes had barely slept, if at all. His violin untouched in the corner, his gaze fixed on the half-burned copy of A Season of Ash, Daphne Cavendish's final, incomplete manuscript. The pages, even in their unfinished form, seemed to taunt him with their silences. "She's still trying to write the ending?" Holmes said, finally. "Clara? No, Daphne." He tapped a line at the bottom margin. "She began revising this scene. Note how she's scratched through dialogue here and here, but didn't replace it. Why? Because she no longer trusted her characters, or herself. Someone had shaken her, Watson, deeply, and that someone wasn't Vera. It was someone far more subtle. Someone who rewrote her without ever lifting a pen. He stood, a strange resolve settling over him. Why need to test the fiction? I frowned. Test what? Her story. Clara believes herself the author now, so we shall give her a scene to play out. One of her own making. That afternoon Holmes sent out 2 invitations, one to Lydia Wren, under the guise of a private literary panel to discuss Daphne Cavendish's legacy, and another to Vera Cartwright, inviting her to the same event as the official heir to Cavendish's final work. The venue was a modest bookshop in Bloomsbury, one of Holmes's more discreet allies. Only a handful of chairs were arranged, but two were carefully positioned, opposite each other, flanked by bookshelves dense with Cavendish's back catalogue. "She won't be able to resist," Holmes murmured as he set the stage. "Two women, one legacy. She'll come to defend her fiction." The bait worked. At 3:30, Vera arrived, her features pale, uncertain, but her spine stiffened with purpose. She clutched a leather folio, clearly containing the manuscript fragments she believed were hers to protect. At 3:42, Lydia Wren entered, poised, unrushed. She wore a dark coat buttoned to the neck, and her eyes swept the room with the ease of a performer approaching a familiar stage. "I wasn't aware this was a panel," she said mildly. Holmes greeted her with warm civility. "Not a panel, a conversation. Surely you would not shy from defending Miss Cavendish's memory." "Not at all," Lydia replied, and took her seat across from Vera. Holmes gave me a slight nod. "I'll just fetch the tea," I said, and slipped behind the curtain to the back room, where Holmes joined me a moment later. He lowered his voice. "Now we wait." In the room beyond, Vera and Lydia sat in taut silence. I peered through the small slit in the curtain. Vera, clutching her folio, Lydia perfectly composed, her gloved hands folded in her lap. And then Holmes did something odd. He stepped out, placed a plain envelope on the table between them, and said, "We recovered this from Duffine's writing desk." Unopened. We thought it was a personal letter, until we found it addressed to no one. A curious thing, don't you think? Vera leaned forward, puzzled. "What does it say?" "We haven't read it," Holmes lied smoothly. "We thought it best to let the two of you decide. You were closest to her in those final weeks." Lydia's expression didn't flicker, but her left hand tensed slightly. Holmes watched her carefully. "Go on." Vera opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper blank. Not a word on it. "What?" Vera frowned. "Is this some kind of joke?" Lydia's eyes darted to the page, then back to Holmes. Holmes smiled faintly. "Odd, isn't it? A writer leaving a blank page in a sealed envelope." Vera looked confused. "But this can't mean anything." "Oh, I assure you, Miss Cartwright, it means everything." Then Lydia did something small, but fatal. She laughed. It was brief, almost inaudible. But Holmes's eyes locked on hers in that instant. "Something amusing, Miss Wren." She paused. "Only that Daphne often used that gesture when someone betrayed her trust. In university, once, a friend of hers plagiarized her. Daphne wrote her a letter with nothing in it, just to say she would never waste another word on her." Holmes's voice was gentle. "That's a very specific memory." Lydia smiled. "She told me about it." "No, Miss Royce?" Holmes said, voice suddenly cold. "She didn't." Lydia froze. "You gave yourself away," he said. "The blank page was my invention. No such letter was ever found. But you knew exactly what it meant, because you were that friend. Clara Royce. You were the first person to steal her words." Her jaw tightened. Holmes continued, relentless. "You vanished after the Rise scandal. Changed your name. Rebuilt your reputation not through publishing, but by editing others. By standing just close enough to greatness that no one would question your presence. You didn't want Daphne's success. You wanted to become her." Vera stood horrified. You killed her." "She rewrote her," Holmes said. "Daphne trusted her. Let her review drafts. But Clara began shaping them, subtly, until Daphne noticed. And then she tried to cut her off." Holmes turned back to Lydia. "And like all authors, You couldn't bear being edited out. Lydia didn't speak. She simply rose, straightened her coat, and looked at Holmes with the tired disappointment of a playwright whose third act had been spoiled. You really do enjoy your little performances. Holmes, she said. But I didn't kill her. Holmes didn't blink. Then tell us what happened. There was a long pause. And then, in a voice too soft for the room, Lydia whispered. She told me I was nothing without her. That no one would ever read my words if they weren't written in her voice. She made me believe it. And did you? Holmes asked. Her gaze didn't waver. For a time, she stepped toward the door. You won't find poison, she said. You won't find fingerprints or notes. What you'll find is an ending she wouldn't finish, and a beginning I refused to let die. Then she was gone. Holmes didn't move. Vera collapsed into the chair, trembling. What now? I asked. She confessed in everything but name, Holmes said. And in doing so, gave us what we needed. What's that? The truth, Holmes said. And an unconventional one at that. This wasn't about murder. It was about authorship. And in the silence that followed, the final page began to write itself. The morning after Lydia Wren, Clara Royce, walked out of the bookshop, Holmes stood at the window of our Baker Street lodgings, unmoving. Outside, the street bustled as usual, but Holmes seemed locked in a different space entirely. The confrontation had revealed truths, but not all. Clara had spoken as though absolved, even dignified. A woman guilty of something profound, yet not murder. It troubled Holmes. She's clever, he said without turning. Too clever to have left so many threads dangling. That wasn't the end. Watson, it was an intermission. I sipped my tea. She as much as confessed. She confessed to possession, to ambition, to reshaping the life of another, but not to Daphne's death. That, I believe, remains unsaid. There came a knock at the door. Lestrade entered, hat in hand, brow furrowed deeper than usual. Holmes immediately turned. You'd best sit down, Lestrade said. We've had a development. Holmes gestured him forward impatiently. The manuscript, Lestrade said. The original Season of Ash, the one we'd secured from Cavendish's desk, was transferred to the Yard last night. Forensics were to review it for fingerprints, any unusual markings. And it's gone. My cup paused midair. Holmes's voice was quiet. Gone. Lestrade nodded. Cabinet broken open, clean job. Whoever did it knew the layout, the rotation of constables, and the alarm's flaws. No sign of forced entry. None. I watched Holmes's face grow still, the calculation beginning behind his eyes. Someone doesn't want us reading the original draft, I said. Not reading, Holmes replied, comparing. Because that manuscript wasn't merely unfinished, it was altered. Subtly, but deliberately. Now we've lost the ability to trace what was truly hers. Lestrade cleared his throat. We've already begun internal inquiries. But Holmes, I don't like this. It feels inside. Holmes nodded. It was inside, and timed perfectly. The moment Clara knew we were circling, the manuscript disappears. But if she's guilty, I said. Why not destroy it herself earlier? Holmes's expression darkened. Because she wasn't the only one with something to lose. He crossed to the writing desk and pulled out a short stack of typed letters. Those from the publisher. Vera said Daphne was going to terminate her contract. The letters here confirm it. She was planning to go independent. New agent. Possibly expose discrepancies in her previous drafts. Which Vera edited, I murmured. And which Clara may have ghosted entirely. Holmes tapped the letter. If Daphne revealed she hadn't written her last two bestsellers alone, the fallout would be immense. Not just for Clara, but for Vera, who profited from the myth. For Ruz, who had been complicit in burying earlier authors. For the publisher who sold the lie. I frowned. So any of them could have taken it. Indeed. And now we must treat every one of them as compromised. A soft knock came again. This time, one of Holmes's Baker Street irregulars, a sharp-eyed boy named Tom, slipped in with his cap in hand. "You said to watch Miss Royce," Tom whispered. "She's not gone far." Holmes turned sharply. "Where?" "She's staying at a boarding house in Maida Vale. Comes and goes with no luggage. But this morning she posted something, a thick envelope. I trailed the postman to the depot. To whom?" Tom held out a scrap of scribbled note. Holmes scanned it quickly. V. Cartwright, care of Milton and Shaw Publishing. "Vera," I said. Holmes grabbed his coat. "She's covering her tracks. Or delivering a final demand. Either way, we must intercept it." Within the hour we arrived at the Milton and Shaw offices, only to find Vera already waiting inside, the envelope on the desk before her. She didn't look surprised to see us, only tired. "I suppose you've come for this," she said, sliding it toward Holmes. "May I?" he asked. She gave a short nod. Inside were 5 pages, typed. Not Daphne's typewriter, but the house machine. A new draft, the missing final chapter. Holmes's eyes scanned the first paragraph, then again slower. "This isn't Daphne's voice," he murmured. Vera rubbed her temples. "It's not. It's Clara's." "Why send it to you?" She said it was to preserve the vision. To finish what was left. She wanted me to publish it posthumously. A tribute. Holmes dropped the pages on the desk. "It's a forgery. A final deception." Vera met his gaze. "But she believes it." That night, Holmes did something curious. He took the burned copy of A Season of Ash, the one Vera had given us, and held it beside the new forged chapter. He marked each sentence where the style shifted, where the rhythm altered subtly. Then, wordlessly, he opened a small lacquered box on his desk. From inside, he withdrew an envelope he'd taken from Cavendish's desk early in the investigation, one he hadn't shown even me. Inside was a torn page. Real paper, stained with Daphne's perfume, inked in longhand. "Holmes, what is that?" He held it up to the light. "The true ending. You had this all along. I suspected it might be the key. But I needed to let Clara believe we had nothing left. Only then would she reveal her counterfeit." The page was devastating in its clarity. It spoke of betrayal. Of a character who had lost her own voice and fought to reclaim it, only to be silenced again. This time by someone she had once called a sister. The metaphors were thinly veiled. It was not fiction. It was a warning. She knew Clara would come for her, Holmes said. And she wrote this to outlast her. She hid it where only someone who loved language, not performance, would look. Tucked in a discarded draft. Under a false bottom in the drawer. "We can prove the forgery now," I said. "Why can prove the motive, but not the means?" Holmes replied, "Not yet. And until we do, Clara, or someone else, will keep trying to erase the truth." He stared at the torn page. "Because now, Watson, the evidence is vanishing faster than we can catch it. And someone very dangerous has decided that endings are theirs to write." In the silence that followed, the shadows around us seemed to stir, curling around truth and fiction alike. The rain returned by morning, slicking the cobbles of Baker Street in a grey sheen and tapping softly against the windows like the ticking of an anxious clock. Holmes had not slept. He remained by the desk where Daphne's torn page lay beneath a glass weight, preserved but fragile. I watched him from the armchair, knowing better than to speak when he was caught in the deeper recesses of thought. Then, suddenly, A rap at the door. Holmes didn't move, but I rose and opened it to find Lestrade, drenched, breathless, his face drawn and pale. He stepped in, clutching a rolled telegram in a trembling hand. "She's gone," he said. Holmes turned slowly. "Clara, no. Vera Cartwright." A beat of silence passed, heavy as thunder. "What do you mean?" "Gone." Lestrade sat down hard on the nearest chair. "I received this note 30 minutes ago. Her housekeeper found her door ajar this morning. No sign of forced entry, but Vera's gone, vanished." "Was the house disturbed?" I asked. "Oddly, no. Purse still on the table. Keys in the bowl. Coat hanging by the door, like she'd never left, or never meant to. But she's not there." Holmes stood abruptly and crossed to the mantel. He picked up a small silver magnifying glass, an odd gesture, almost automatic, then paused. "She wouldn't run," he murmured. "She was brittle, yes, but not cowardly, and certainly not Novra. She knew Clara could be dangerous." "Unless," I said. "She didn't fear Clara anymore. Or," Holmes said grimly, "she was silenced by someone else entirely." Within the hour, we were at Vera's townhouse. The constables had already begun a cursory search, but Holmes waved them off and began his own inspection with practiced calm. The hall was clean, nearly too clean. He knelt by the coat rack, then at the baseboards, then traced his fingers along the lower windowsill of the drawing room. "Notice the dust line?" he said, pointing. I peered closer. "What of it?" "That frame was recently moved. Only slightly. But deliberately." He shifted the heavy portrait of a landscape to the side. Behind it, a tiny pinhole in the wall, neatly drilled. Holmes removed a small brass tube from his coat and held it to the hole. "Listen." We were silent. At first I heard nothing. Then, barely audible, a soft metallic hum, a ticking. Not a clock. Machinery. Next door, I guessed. Holmes nodded. Possibly a listening device, not police issue. Which means someone else was keeping tabs on her. "Clara." Holmes shook his head. "Too theatrical for Clara. She prefers pens to wires." He stepped back. This house wasn't broken into. It was accessed with trust. She knew the visitor. She let them in, spoke calmly, and never realized what was coming. Lestrade entered again, a paper in hand. "One more thing. Her maid found this in the waste bin, torn in half. Thought you'd want it." Holmes took the fragment. It was the end of a letter, signed only with an initial R. "Res Cavendish," I muttered. Holmes's eyes darkened. "He's been oddly quiet since his initial interview." Lestrade shifted. "He's disappeared, too. Called out of the office 2 days ago. No forwarding address. His landlord says he cleared out suddenly." Holmes folded the paper carefully. "Then I suspect Vera's disappearance and Russ's vanishing are connected. But not as perpetrator and victim. No. This smacks of partnership. You think she ran with him? I think they planned something. Perhaps to disappear with the last trace of Daphne's truth. Or perhaps Vera was planning to reveal more, and Russ couldn't let that happen." We returned to Baker Street with the tension of something gathering behind us, a storm not yet released. But we did not have to wait long. Just past dusk a knock came again, furious, urgent. A young constable stood panting in the doorway. "There's been an attack," he gasped. "Someone broke into the bookshop." "The Clock and Quill," I said. "Mr. Brightwell's been stabbed. He's alive, barely. But the back room was ransacked." Holmes had his coat before the sentence finished. We rushed through the soaking streets to the familiar storefront, now lit with harsh gaslight, and guarded by 2 constables. Inside, the scent of blood mingled with ink and old leather. Brightwell was already on a stretcher, being tended by a surgeon. A long slash marked his side. but he clutched Holmes's hand as we approached. They weren't here for money," he rasped. "What then?" Holmes asked. "The ledger. My records of every manuscript that passed through this shop. Gone." Holmes's jaw clenched. "And the client files. Scattered. Some torn. But they knew what they wanted. They took only Lydia's." As they moved Brightwell out, Holmes stood unmoving beside the counter. "Someone is burning every bridge to Daphne's past. Every thread. They are closing the circle." "You think Rez came here?" Holmes didn't answer. He was watching the back room door. Then, quietly, "No. I think someone else did. Someone who knew Brightwell wouldn't resist until they reached for the wrong file. Which means Clara isn't done, and she may not be working alone." The front bell jingled faintly. We turned, no one there. Only a draft from the door, swinging slightly. Holmes was at it in 2 strides. Pinned to the outside frame was a single page, handwritten in smooth, even strokes. "Truth is not a destination, Mr. Holmes. It is a performance, and this one is not yet over. No signature, no smudge. Only the faint scent of lavender and ink, Clara's scent." Holmes turned to me, eyes blazing. "She's not just hiding the truth anymore, Watson. She's rewriting it." And we were running out of time. The letter's ominous final line lingered in the stale air of the bookshop, but Holmes's mind had already turned beyond words, sifting through fragments like a master chess player arranging his pieces. The labyrinth of deception Clara had woven was tighter now. Every move she made, every step she took, carefully choreographed to confuse and misdirect. Yet, Holmes knew that no ruse could withstand relentless scrutiny. As the shop closed for the night, I observed Holmes pacing, restless. His gaze, sharp and unblinking, fell repeatedly on a peculiar detail we had overlooked before: the odd angle of a small inkwell on Brightwell's counter. It was tipped just slightly, a sliver of its black contents staining the mahogany surface. It seemed accidental at first, but Holmes crouched to examine the spill's edges. "Watson," he said softly, "notice this spill's drying pattern, uneven, disrupted." I leaned closer, suggesting movement. Exactly. Someone was interrupted. Holmes's fingers traced the faint arcs in the dried ink. This was no mere accident. The culprit hurriedly moved the bottle. Yet why? What forced their hand? I scanned the room, eyes resting on the scattered papers, the torn ledger pages, and the chaotic scattering of Lydia's files. But none struck me as unusual, until I noticed a subtle recurring detail across the mess: the repeated appearance of a peculiar symbol. A small, looping flourish at the bottom of several notes and torn scraps. A stylized letter C, written in the same delicate hand as Clara's letters. "Look at these," I said, pointing. Holmes took the scraps, his eyes narrowing. A signature mark. Clara leaves her mark, even when she erases herself. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces began to click into place. The fractured messages, the disappearances, the carefully planted evidence, all of it bore the trace of Clara's influence. She was not just an elusive suspect. She was the puppeteer manipulating every thread. But why? Holmes rose and strode to the window, peering through the murky glass at the restless city beyond. "She wants control," he said quietly. "Not merely to hide the truth, but to dictate the narrative itself. The endings, the characters, all hers to command." I sat heavily, digesting the thought. "So, the clues, the chaos, it's a story she's telling." "Precisely. A story where she controls the outcome." Holmes returned to the counter and rifled through Brightwell's remaining files. His gaze sharpened as he uncovered a set of letters exchanged between Clara and an unknown correspondent. Their content was cryptic, discussions of unfinished tales and erased endings, with veiled references to past grievances and debts unsettled. "Watson, this isn't merely about Daphne anymore," Holmes murmured. "It's about Clara's own narrative. The one she's rewriting. One page at a time." A sudden knock startled us, and Lestrade entered, carrying a telegram. "Another development," he said grimly. "Vera Cartwright's body was found early this morning, near the river. No signs of struggle, but an identical symbol, this stylized C, etched faintly on her wrist." Holmes's eyes darkened. "A signature left by Clara herself." I swallowed hard. "Is this a warning? More likely a message." As Lestrade left to handle the growing chaos, Holmes turned to me, voice low but resolute. "Watson, the pattern is emerging. Clara's handiwork is everywhere, subtle, deliberate, chilling. We must follow these marks, these flourishes, to the story's final chapter." He paused, fingers curling around the letter fragment from the bookshop. "Every story has its key, the clue hidden in plain sight, overlooked by all but the keenest eye. And you believe this small symbol is that key?" Holmes nodded. "Yes. It ties the past to the present, the victims to the villain. The pattern was always here, we only needed to recognize it." Outside, the city's fog thickened, swallowing the lamplight and shadows alike. Within that creeping mist, the truth awaited, patient, inscrutable, and deadly. And with every passing moment, Clara's story edged closer to its dark conclusion, where the final pages would be written in blood. Holmes sat back in the dim light of the bookshop, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he considered the fragments before him. The pattern was clear, but its meaning was still shrouded in shadow. Clara's symbol, the delicate C, had marked both victims, yet the purpose behind these calculated acts remained elusive. It was more than mere spite or vengeance, something deeper, darker, pulsed beneath the surface. We returned to the bookshop the following morning, seeking anything overlooked. As Holmes sifted through the scattered papers and torn pages, I watched the quiet intensity in his eyes. He was not merely assembling clues, he was unraveling a psyche, a mind that had chosen to rewrite reality itself. "Watson," he began without looking up. "The victims, Brightwell and Cartwright, appear unrelated on the surface, yet both were entangled in Clara's life. Not through rivalry or financial gain, but through their shared role in erasing her story." I frowned, uncertain. "You mean they interfered with her work?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Yes, but more than that. They acted as gatekeepers of her narrative. Brightwell, the publisher who refused her latest manuscript; Cartwright, the editor who suggested changes that Clara vehemently opposed. Their rejection was not merely professional. It was personal. A dismissal of her creative identity." He stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the mist-blanketed street below. "To Clara, her stories were more than fiction, they were extensions of herself. Each plot, every character, reflected her truths, her fears. When those truths were challenged or altered, she perceived it as an assault on her very being. The revelation settled heavily between us. This was no ordinary vendetta. It was the torment of a mind desperately clinging to control, willing to eradicate anything that threatened to rewrite her reality." Holmes returned to the counter, pulling open a drawer to reveal a bundle of letters he'd carefully preserved. "Read this," he said, handing me a letter penned in a trembling hand. The words were frantic, pleading, Clara's own account of betrayal, of erasure. She wrote of how her stories were stolen and mutilated, her voice silenced by those who refused to honor her vision. As I read, a chilling understanding dawned. This was not merely a crime of passion or greed. It was a psychological crusade. Clara's mind fractured under the weight of rejection, driving her to literal erasure of those who defied her narrative. Holmes's voice broke the silence. Her motive transcends common causes. It is rooted in a profound identity crisis, manifesting as a need to control every outcome. This need, unchecked, escalated to murder. I looked up sharply. So, the crimes were her way of reclaiming control, of authoring her own ending. Precisely. To Clara, the boundaries between fiction and reality blurred. The story must end on her terms, or not at all. Holmes's eyes darkened as he folded the letter carefully. This also explains the cryptic symbol. The C is both signature and brand, a mark of ownership. By leaving it, Clara declares authorship of the crime, just as she demanded ownership of her stories. A sudden knock startled us, and Lestrade stepped in, urgency etched on his face. "Holmes, we've uncovered something new. A diary belonging to Clara hidden at her lodgings. It details a final chapter, a plan to confront those who betrayed her story." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Then the ending approaches, Watson. We must prepare to face the author herself, before she writes one last, irrevocable line." As the city's fog deepened, so too did the shadows within Clara's fractured mind. The truth was no longer a distant mystery, it was a living narrative, unfolding rapidly toward a conclusion only Holmes could decipher. The late afternoon sun had waned into a pallid grey, casting long shadows across the narrow streets as Holmes and I approached Clara's lodgings. A modest, weather-worn flat nestled above a quiet bookstore. The air was thick with the weight of inevitability. Holmes moved with a calculated calm, every step measured, every thought clearly focused on the impending confrontation. We were no longer merely pursuing a case. We were about to face the fractured author who had rewritten fate in blood. Inside the dim room, the air was heavy with the scent of old paper and ink. Clara sat by the window, a pale figure framed by the fading light, her eyes darting nervously between us as we entered. The symbol, the delicate C, was etched faintly into the dust on the windowsill, an echo of her presence, a signature on her final act. Holmes's gaze was steady, unyielding. "Miss Clara," he began, voice calm yet edged with authority, "your story has taken many turns, but it is time to bring the narrative to a close." She swallowed hard, fingers trembling as she clutched a worn manuscript to her chest. "You don't understand," she whispered. "They took everything from me, my voice, my endings. I only wanted to reclaim what was mine." Holmes stepped forward, voice softening. "We understand your pain, but the path you chose has led to tragedy. Brightwell, Cartwright, they were victims of your desperate attempt to control the story." Her eyes flashed with a mixture of defiance and despair. "They erased me, changed my words, destroyed the truth hidden beneath the lines. How could I let that happen?" Holmes held up a letter, one she had written in a moment of clarity. "You sought control, yes, but you must understand that stories like lives cannot be dictated by one hand alone. The truth always finds a way." Her shoulders sagged, the walls of her carefully constructed narrative crumbling. Suddenly, a sharp sound shattered the fragile silence. A window rattled, and from the shadows outside, a figure lunged toward the room, clutching a knife glinting in the fading light. Holmes reacted instantly, his hand moving with preternatural speed to intercept the attack. The struggle was brief but intense, the intruder's desperation evident. I joined Holmes, restraining the assailant as Clara collapsed against the wall, trembling. Breathless, Holmes demanded, "Who sent you? Who else is involved?" The man's defiance broke under Holmes's unyielding gaze. "She can't finish the story. It would ruin everything, for all of us." Holmes's expression hardened. "Then your narrative ends here." With the assailant secured and Clara subdued, Holmes returned his attention to her, voice resolute yet compassionate. "Miss Clara, your story need not end in darkness. Confess, and perhaps the final chapter can be written with redemption, not ruin." Tears welled in her eyes as the weight of truth pressed down. "I was lost," she admitted, voice breaking. "But I want to stop this. I want to make things right." Holmes nodded. "Then let us begin the real ending. One where justice and truth prevail." As the night deepened, the tangled threads of deception, pain, and control finally unraveled. The author of chaos had been unmasked, not merely as a criminal, but as a broken soul desperate for a final chapter of her own making. And in that revelation lay the promise of closure. Not just for the victims, but for Clara herself. The morning light seeped through the half-drawn curtains of Clara's flat, casting a pale glow over the quiet room. Holmes sat opposite her, fingers steepled, eyes narrowed in contemplation. The assailant, now in police custody, had confessed to acting under instructions, but Holmes's mind was restless. The threads of this tangled case, though seemingly tied, still felt frayed at the edges. As I observed Holmes's intense focus, the door creaked open and Inspector Lestrade entered, holding a small, crumpled envelope. "Mr. Holmes, this was found slipped under the door while you were here," he said, handing it over. The paper was thin and worn, with no name or return address, just a single, typed line. "You have not yet read the final chapter." Holmes's eyes flickered with a rare flash of intrigue. He rose and began pacing, his mind racing to weave this unexpected note into the puzzle. "It seems our tale has one more page yet to be turned," he murmured. "We must tread carefully, for the author of this message is someone who watches from the shadows." We examined the envelope closely. The typeface was an old-fashioned serif, common enough, but Holmes immediately recognized it as the style used in the correspondence of one of the key figures we had previously discounted. Geraldine March, Brightwell's literary agent. She had appeared cooperative, even helpful, during our interviews, but her eagerness had felt rehearsed. Now, this message suggested a hidden hand. I recalled our earlier visits to March's office, where she had insisted that Clara was unstable and had motive enough for the crimes. Holmes, however, had always treated her with polite suspicion. The letter confirmed his intuition. The true mastermind might be someone who had skillfully orchestrated events from behind a veil of civility. Holmes instructed Lestrade to accompany us to March's office. The building was an unassuming brick facade on a bustling street, but inside, the air was heavy with secrets. We found March seated calmly behind her desk, eyes sharp but betraying no surprise at our arrival. "Miss March," Holmes began, his tone even, "you appear to be quite involved in this narrative, far beyond your role as an agent." She smiled thinly, her composure intact. "I have only ever sought to protect my clients and their interests." Holmes's gaze locked with hers. "And yet, someone attempted to silence Clara and manipulate this case to suit their own ends. Perhaps you'd care to explain why you were seen near the scene the night of the second attack." March's forehead faltered. Just for a moment, a flicker of fear or perhaps frustration. I was concerned for Clara's safety. She had become unpredictable. Holmes leaned forward, voice cold as steel. Predictable fear does not lead to orchestrated attacks and falsified evidence. You stand accused of crafting this chaos, planting misinformation, and manipulating witnesses. The motives are clear: profit from control, suppress inconvenient truths, and protect your own standing. March rose abruptly, eyes blazing. "You have no proof. You're twisting shadows into chains." Holmes gestured calmly. "But your typed letter?" slipped covertly under Clara's door, carefully crafted to misdirect, and the forged documents we uncovered linking you to the fabricated threats. The inconsistencies in your statements sealed your fate. March's resolve crumbled under the weight of evidence. Her confession spilled forth. A bitter admission that the entire scandal was engineered to secure a lucrative publishing deal by sabotaging Clara's reputation and monopolizing the rights to her unfinished works. As the authorities moved to take March into custody, Holmes turned to me quietly. The final twist was not merely in the act itself, but in the shadows that hid behind false faces. The greatest deception is often wrapped in the guise of help. Clara, now safe and recovering, looked toward a future no longer dictated by manipulation. Holmes's sharp eye and relentless pursuit of truth had unraveled not just a crime, but the hidden web of greed and betrayal beneath. In the end, the story was far from closed, but justice, at last, was beginning its new chapter. The grey drizzle pattered against the windows of 221B Baker Street as Holmes sat unmoving in his armchair, the faint aroma of pipe smoke curling around him like a lingering thought. Outside, carriages splashed through puddles, but inside, the silence was thick, expectant. I had been watching Holmes for the better part of an hour, wondering if he was content now that Geraldine March had been arrested, yet something in his stillness suggested otherwise. "She didn't act alone," Holmes said suddenly, his voice quiet but edged with certainty. I blinked. "But she confessed. The notes, the motive, the forged letters, all trace back to her." "Indeed, she was the executor," Holmes replied. "But not the architect." I leaned forward. "Then who?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. He stood cross to his desk and withdrew a worn manuscript envelope. Clara had given it to him days earlier, her last completed draft before she stopped writing. Holmes had read it thrice, each time more slowly than the last. He tapped the cover now. Clara's manuscript. Its final chapter was missing, yes, but not accidentally. She removed it deliberately. She feared it revealed too much. "You believe the key lies in what she chose to withhold?" Holmes nodded. "And I believe someone else knew exactly what was in that chapter. Someone powerful enough to make her doubt her own sanity, to orchestrate an elaborate frame job, and to push March to act as their agent." I felt a cold unease settle in. But why go to such lengths? "To bury a secret Clara accidentally unearthed," Holmes said. "A secret that would destroy a reputation far more influential than March's. The real villain is someone Clara once admired, someone who inspired her." Holmes reached into his drawer again and produced a letter, handwritten in elegant cursive. "This arrived yesterday. No signature, but unmistakable in style. Read carefully." I took the letter and read aloud. "My dear Miss Brightwell, stories are more dangerous than truth, for they are believed before they are proven. Let your ink rest. The past cannot be rewritten, but it can be forgotten. Yours as ever." My brow furrowed. Cryptic, but it sounds like a warning. "It is," Holmes said. And I recognized the handwriting. He pulled a monograph from his bookshelf, opening it to the dedication to Clara Brightwell, whose pen stirs truth from shadow. "Forever grateful, L.R., a celebrated author, Lionel Rooke, one of the most respected names in British literary circles, and Clara's former mentor." "Rooke?" I said in disbelief. "But he's a national treasure." Holmes paced slowly. And he had everything to lose. Clara's final chapter implicated him in a long, buried scandal. Plagiarism, abuse of protégés, the silencing of voices that threatened his legacy. March acted under his influence, believing she was preserving the golden goose that laid both their careers. I felt the weight of it then. How Rooke, so untouchable by public perception, had pulled strings from behind the curtain. But we have no proof. Only implication. Exactly, Holmes said, with something close to frustration. March never named him. Clara never published the chapter. And Rook is too clever to leave fingerprints. We both knew what that meant. Justice, in its ideal form, would not be served today. The man at the heart of the storm would remain untarnished, for now. Later that afternoon, we accompanied Clara to the station to watch Geraldine March be transported to Holloway Prison. The rain had stopped, and the clouds were beginning to thin. Clara stood silent beside us, her expression unreadable. She was only a part of it, she said softly. Holmes nodded. But the part we could catch. Clara turned to him, voice low. Will the rest ever come to light? Perhaps, Holmes said. Truth has a way of surfacing. Like ink on damp paper, it bleeds through eventually. That night, back in Baker Street, Holmes finally spoke the words I had known he was turning over all day. It wasn't just deduction, Watson. It was instinct. The note under the door, it was meant to bait me, not warn Clara. A challenge from a fellow writer, daring me to finish the story he began. And I did, but in truth our villain walks free, I sighed. So he escapes justice. For now, Holmes replied, but not forever. Reputation is a fragile thing, especially for a man who trades in words. One misstep, one revelation, and the curtain falls. And Clara, she will write again, Holmes said. And perhaps when she does, she will not erase the ending. We sat in silence a while longer, and then Holmes looked at me with a thin smile. You see, Watson, it was never the missing chapter that solved the case. It was the fact that someone needed it gone so desperately. That, more than any clue, told us the truth. He leaned back, the flicker of satisfaction in his eyes tempered by something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, that not all victories are complete, and not all truths are welcomed by the world that fears them. Holmes stood at the window of 221B Baker Street, eyes distant as he watched the thin morning fog begin to dissolve above the rooftops. Clara Brightwell had left a few hours earlier, manuscript in hand, determined to write again. Not a mystery this time, but a truth. Geraldine March had been imprisoned. Lionel Rook, though untouched by law, had withdrawn from the public eye. To the outside world, the case was over. But Holmes had not lit his pipe. I closed the newspaper, where the headline boldly read, Celebrated detectives autors mardia. I placed it aside, unsatisfied. It's a tidy conclusion, I said. But it doesn't feel complete. Holmes gave no reply. He stepped to the mantel, where a plain ivory envelope had been resting since dawn. No address. No markings. Just his name, Sherlock Holmes, written in precise block letters. He picked it up for the 5th time and opened it once more, spreading the single sheet of paper flat against the table. You've missed one loose thread, detective, it read. 1 comma out of place, 1 shadow in the corner. The final draft was never truly final. I leaned over his shoulder. Rook. Almost certainly. But what does it mean? 1 comma out of place? It sounds like nonsense. Or it sounds like a clue, Holmes murmured. He retrieved Clara's manuscript, the duplicate copy she had gifted him, her final act of trust. He turned to the final chapter, the one she had rewritten in peace, no longer afraid. With slow precision, Holmes read every line aloud, and I could feel the air tighten around us with each sentence. There it was, a subtle inconsistency. In the 2nd paragraph, Holmes said, tapping the page, she describes the mahogany writing desk by the eastern window. I nodded. Yes, that was in her study. But in her earlier chapters, he continued, flipping back, The desk was always referred to as by the western window. It may seem trivial, but Clara was meticulous. Direction meant structure. A shift like that was intentional. You think she embedded a message? I think she left us an unfinished sentence. He rose abruptly and fetched a copy of her earlier published novel, The Violet Corridor. He scanned to a familiar passage and pointed. Hair. A scene describing a letter hidden in a secret compartment, revealed only when the drawer was removed and rotated under eastern light. Fiction, perhaps. Or memory. Within the hour, we were once again standing in Clara's study. The room had been sealed, but the authorities, having closed the case, offered no resistance to Holmes's request. The desk, solid mahogany, finely carved, sat by the western window again, as it always had. Holmes stepped to it, examined the drawers, then carefully slid the central one free. The back panel was loose. Deliberately so. He adjusted the drawer and rotated it under the sunlight filtering from the east-facing window opposite. There, barely visible, was a narrow slit behind the false bottom. Holmes reached in, fingers deft, and drew out a folded sheet of paper yellowed with age. Clara's handwriting. A draft dated 3 years earlier. At the top for safekeeping, should I lose my way. It detailed a correspondence between Clara and Rook, once warm, then growing colder. Her final entry described a dinner meeting where Rook, having drunk too much wine, had confessed to appropriating one of her early ideas, reshaping it into his acclaimed novella The Glass Threshold. Clara, stunned, had tried to confront him later, but he denied everything. The letter was not accusatory, it was heartbreak in ink, a record of trust betrayed. She never intended to use this against him, I said quietly. Holmes nodded. Which makes her murder all the more monstrous. Rook killed not to protect his name, but to silence guilt before it could speak. He folded the page again, slid it into his coat. Why now have what we lacked? Intent, means, and motive written in her own hand. But it comes too late for the courts. What will you do with it? I shall keep it, he said. And when the time comes, when Rook steps forward again into the light, this letter will find its way to the right hands. We stepped out into the quiet street, the city somehow more alive now that the fog had lifted. But as we walked, Holmes's eyes narrowed. Across the square, a figure stood in the doorway of a bookshop, hat pulled low, coat collar high. Not unusual in itself, but the figure was still, watching, and when Holmes paused, the man turned and vanished into the alley behind. Did you see? I began.
Yes,
Holmes said. And I've seen him before. Where? Outside the theater. The night Clara died. He was leaning against the lamppost across the street. I thought nothing of it then. But if he was watching, then perhaps Rook is not finished, Holmes murmured. Or perhaps someone else was always involved. A silence fell between us as the weight of unfinished business pressed close once again. You once said, I began, that every mystery has its end. I did, Holmes replied. But I've learned that some mysteries are like echoing footsteps in a long corridor. They never truly stop, only fade, until the next door opens. And with that, we turned the corner and walked on, the sound of Baker Street slowly fading behind us, even as the next question took shape in the quiet.